Thank you. So I'm Naomi Roy. I'm one of the consultant hematologists in Oxford, and it's my real pleasure to introduce Brenda to you today. I first heard Brenda talk at ASCA, the annual Sickle Cell and Thalassemia Conference in London 5 years ago, and since then I've been one of her biggest fans and followers. So Brenda is, she's going to be talking today about the PHYSIC study and understanding fatigue experiences of children and young people with sickle cell disease, and this has been really the focus of her research. She first came to do her PhD in Manchester University, having studied nursing in Ghana, and she was studying fatigue in young people at the time. And then she moved on to the University of Nottingham, School of Health Sciences, as a research fellow and was working on systematic reviews. And now she's a research associate and a co-PI on an NIHR Research for Patient Benefit funded project, which she's going to talk to us about the results of this study. I will let Brenda introduce and give her presentation, and then we will have questions at the end. Thank you very much. Brenda, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Dr. Roy, and thank you, Ralph, for organizing this, and thank you to everybody for attending. So just as Dr. Roy highlighted, I'm here to present on the current work that we just completed, looking at fatigue experiences of children and young people with sickle cell disease in the UK. And I've moved on from Manchester, now with a new project that I'm leading that is working with migrant children and young people with sickle cell in the UK. So I'm currently based at the University of Nottingham at the School of Sociology and Social Policy. So in terms of my presentation, I'm just going to talk about why we chose to do this work, what the objectives were, how we went about it, and what we found, and what we're trying to really, the message we're trying to really get across to health professionals and also to the wider sickle cell community. So just by way of the team and some disclosure, the project was funded by the National Institute for Health and National for Health and Care Research. And I just want to highlight that the presentation are purely the views of the authors and not necessarily endorsed by NIHR. So in terms of investigators, myself and Professor Susan Kirk at the University of Manchester, we were the chief investigators on the project. And our co-investigators included Professor Carl Atkin, who is based at the University of York. We had Dr. John Granger, who is a hematology consultant at Manchester University NHS Trust, and also we had Messi Amide Thomas from the Sickle Cell Society as investigators on the project. We also have a steady steering group that supported the project. Naomi was part of that group, and we also worked with 3 young people with sickle cell disease who were advisors on the project. So in terms of why we chose to do this work, as we all know, chronic anemia is a distinctive nature of sickle cell disease. And we also understand that this anemia presents in the form of chronic fatigue for people living with sickle cell disease. And more than a decade ago, some researchers in the US tried to identify the various factors that can contribute to fatigue in sickle cell disease. So they did highlighted some of the disease factors, such as the low oxygen concentration, the inflammatory processes that underline sickle cell disease, as well as the vaso-occlusive crisis and the mechanisms that leads to those crises can all have an impact on fatigue. And also in terms of personal factors such as the depression and anxiety that comes with living with and growing up with sickle cell disease can all contribute to fatigue. But fatigue seems to be quite silent when it comes to research and in care as well. But it doesn't mean that it's not significant. There has been some, although limited studies that have looked at the prevalence, the frequency, as well as the potential impact of fatigue for people living with sickle cell disease. And in terms of prevalence, I'd like to highlight 2 major studies that have recently been done. The first one is the SWAY study that really looked at the impact of sickle cell disease on the daily life of patients. It was an international study that involved 16 countries in 6 geographical regions across the world. And one of the main things that came out of that project was that fatigue was the most reported symptom aside from vaso-occlusive crisis. There was also a recent global survey known as the SHAPE study that looked at the impact of sickle cell disease on the quality of life of patients and caregivers. That was also done across 10 countries. And so far, the data that is coming from the UK has highlighted fatigue as the most common physical symptom of sickle cell disease. In terms of frequency, what we know from the existing literature is that fatigue is a daily symptom, is not something that is episodic, but it's a symptom that is experienced on a daily basis. Its intensity is on a spectrum ranging from being mild to severe. And what has also been highlighted is that the fatigue in terms of frequency was independent of the hemoglobin levels. In a US study, what they found was that even for patients who were identified as clinically stable and had appreciable hemoglobin levels, still reported moderate to severe fatigue. Fatigue has also been associated with poorer quality of life, with increased episode of acute pain crisis, with depression and anxiety, with behavioral problems, school absences, and reduced cognitive function, as well as increased hospitalization rate in adolescent and young adults with sickle cell disease. But what consistently has been lacking is really patient day-to-day experience of the symptom and patient own reported experiences of the impact that fatigue has on them on a day-to-day basis. So as part of my PhD, as Dr. Roy highlighted, I looked at fatigue experiences of children and young people with sickle cell disease in Ghana. And what came out of this study was that fatigue was a significant barrier to social, educational, employment, and family participation. It significantly impacted on how the young people perceive themselves and also their sense of normality. And this was because of the increased social and physical activeness that was expected of young people. And their inability to be able to demonstrate that meant that fatigue had a stigmatizing consequences for the young people. It had an impact on how they perceived their future and also the educational and professional goals that they pursued. So we also realized that there hasn't been any study from the UK contextually to provide data and understanding when it comes to fatigue and the wider support that was available for managing the symptom for children and young people. And that is why we undertook the FIX study to try and understand UK children and young people with sickle cell disease and their parents' everyday experiences of this significant but yet overlooked symptom and the impact that fatigue had on them and how they managed it on a day-to-day basis. We're also interested in being able to understand what currently the support systems that are available for fatigue and what the children and young people, parents, and their care providers view about the current services and available for that symptom. And we also went on to look at what they perceive should be considered in a future interventional program for fatigue in sickle cell disease. So that is what I'm going to talk about in the presentation, but I'm going to focus more on the first 3 objectives. So in terms of what we did, we recruited from one UK hospital, and we also recruited through sickle cell focused charities. We also went through social media to recruit. So we're focused on children and young people with sickle cell disease who were aged between 12 to 24 years. We're also looking at looking for parents to participate and share their perspective, as well as healthcare professionals. So this was a qualitative study. We used semi-structured interviews, and all the interviews were conducted remotely. And for the young people, there was the option for them to participate in art-based activities. So they could provide photographs, drawings, or poems that relate to their experiences or that were meaningful to their experiences. And we use this artwork to facilitate and also to guide the conversations with the young people during the interviews. So when I get to the findings, I will be presenting what we found out alongside some of these artwork that the young people produced. So in terms of the participants, we included 27 people in the study. 12 of them were children and young people with sickle cell disease who were within the ages of 16 to 23 years. Majority of them identified to be of Black and African heritage. Most of them had sickle cell anemia, specifically SS genotype. Most of them perceived their condition to be of moderate severity, and majority of them were also in college. In terms of health professionals, we interviewed 10 of them. 4 were specialist nurses providing both community and acute care. We also interviewed 3 clinical psychologists. There was 1 consultant hematologist, 1 specialist physiotherapist, and a youth worker. And we also interviewed 5 parents. All of them were mothers, and they identified their child's condition to be of moderate severity. So in terms of what we found out of it was that fatigue was a real and a tangible aspect of sickle cell disease. It was an independent symptom on its own, and sometimes it was also linked to other symptoms of sickle cell disease. So it was both an independent and a real tangible symptom standing on its own, or it could also occur in the presence of other symptoms associated with sickle cell disease, like the pain, depression, and anxiety as well. So fatigue also presented as having low or no energy. So they talked about their fatigue in relation to their energy capacity. And this, what we found out was that it meant that children and young people with sickle cell disease do not have adequate energy for daily activities, and that fatigue was even present at rest. And this was evident in some of the analogies that the young people used to describe their fatigue. One person talked about it as is having the body or the appearance of a 4-wheel drive, but the engine capacity of a very small car like a Fiat. So just to really highlight that it's all about having the energy capacity to be able to meet up and be able to engage as expected. There was also one that drew this low battery sign to really talk about the fact that living with sickle cell means constantly having to navigate day-to-day life on a low battery capacity. We also found that fatigue was experienced as a physical and a mental heaviness that they struggle to overcome daily. So they constantly need extreme mental and physical effort for daily activities. So even mundane and simple things as getting out of bed in the morning, going out with friends, and even remaining attentive in school all required greater mental and physical effort to be able to engage. So in terms of some of the analogies they used, one young person said that fatigue is like constantly having your bones to be replaced with lead. So it sits on them as a heaviness and a burden that they have to constantly overcome in order to be able to engage. We also found that sickle cell fatigue for children and young people involves both physical, cognitive, emotional, and social feelings. And this included frequent exhaustion, breathlessness, dizziness, headaches, and this constant urge to sleep. And for them, it was something that they couldn't shake, especially the urge to sleep. Cognitively, they struggled to concentrate because of the fatigue, and emotionally, that causes frustration. There was lack of motivation and interest, that is meaning not having the energy capacity to be able to continue to engage and meet expectation. And that really brought about this feeling of anger and sadness for the young people. And socially, it causes them to withdraw. And for some of them, there was preference for solitary activities that didn't need a lot of energy to undertake. There were significant differences in the experiences. There were differences between sickle cell fatigue and normal tiredness. So what we found that unlike normal tiredness, fatigue in sickle cell disease for children and young people, it was persistent, it was constant, and it was continuous. One young person described it as a housemate, that is something that you are living with, is part of your daily life. One psychologist trying to construct sickle cell fatigue from normal tiredness, liken sickle cell fatigue to the sky as something that is expansive, is enduring, and ever present, unlike normal tiredness, which they liken it to cloud, as something that collect. It transient, and once it rains, it clears. So that is how they see normal tiredness to be different from fatigue in sickle cell disease. One young person also talk about how fatigue is present, even right from early in the morning, when even after having a good night's sleep, you still wake up being tired. And as you go through the day, you experience it, and then it gets heightened as the day comes to a close. So the fatigue in sickle cell disease was presented as a symptom that was not relieved by sleep, nor was it associated with extreme exertion or burnout as compared to normal tiredness. The symptom was also found to be dynamic. For the young people, they have to constantly move between having low energy or having no energy. So they have to switch between having a moderate level fatigue to severe fatigue. And it moves to severe fatigue as the day goes by, or as they engage in day-to-day activities. And when it is mild or moderate, they tend to keep it in the background. And what that means is that they have to strive through it, ignore it, and try to be able to continue to engage in their day-to-day life and be able to meet expectation. But once it becomes severe, then it comes to the foreground, which means that it then shuts them down, and then it takes over and controls their whole body. So from the interviews, it was clear that there were some factors that shifted fatigue from being a mild or a moderate symptom to one of a severe symptom. So some of the factors that were identified included dehydration, exertion, and this was all forms of exertion, from physical, emotional to mental exertion. Pain crisis was also described as one factor that worsened or contributed to fatigue. The use of strong pain medications to manage pain crisis. Some of the young people also clearly said that if they missed their sickle cell medication, and most of them were talking in terms of hydroxyurea or not taking their folic acid, they realized that their fatigue also got worse from that. And also if they don't eat healthily and adequately, they also struggle with the fatigue. There was a clear interlink between fatigue and pain. Fatigue was seen to be a trigger of a pain crisis, and for most of the young people, severe fatigue always triggered a crisis. Fatigue was also described as a warning sign of an imminent pain. So for most of the young people, when they become severely fatigued, they know that pain is imminent or a crisis is going to come out of it. And fatigue was also described as a consequence of pain, that it always was present during a pain crisis, and it was after a pain crisis. So that was the kind of linkage that we saw between the two symptoms. And that was one adolescent attempted to show that in a picture to really describe how fatigue and pain are linked in terms of how the fatigue brings on the crisis then makes the fatigue worse, and also the medication as well makes the crisis and the fatigue worse consequently. So in terms of the impact of fatigue for young people, what we realized was that it affected all aspects of the children and young people's lives.
That one doesn't work for some reason. I don't know why.
It had an impact on their physical, on their social, emotional, mental, educational, and their professional lives as well. And families also struggled to be able to encourage and support the young people's independence because of the fatigue. And one parent really highlighted how frustrating it is to see her son struggle with fatigue on a daily basis. She talked about the fact that his son wasn't able to move fast. Daily, he walked so slowly, does everything so slow because he's trying not to get too tired. He doesn't like going out a lot. He's always sleeping and always indoors. Tends not to be self-motivated and sometimes miss school, not because of the pain, but just because he's too tired to make it to school. And for the mother, he sees that as a struggle, especially for his son, who was at an age that should be physically and socially active. He just cannot cope because of the fatigue. It was also clear that fatigue had a social impact on the young people. It reduces their ability to build the resources and the skills that is needed, or associated with being a normal teenager or a young adult, especially when it comes to their social interactions and their social relationships. For them, interacting and keeping up with peers and activities were very difficult because it requires energy, and for them, they found that as very exhausting. And because of that, they tend to socially isolate or withdraw because they struggle to keep up. And their ability not to be able to meet their expectations and continually engage with peers exposed them to stigma. They were being labeled as lazy, as uninteresting, withdrawn, and some of them even felt they were being described as awkward. So this was really something that came out not just in the interviews, but also in the artworks that the young people produced. So for one young child, he produced this drawing of a game console to really highlight how everybody in the game is doing something, but for him, he's been trapped in this bubble because of having that low energy and insufficient energy capacity to be able to continually engage. So he felt really isolated and withdrawn and separated from peers. One young person also produced this poem to really highlight that the struggle against fatigue was something that could never be won for them on a day-to-day basis. Fatigue constantly had the upper hand. So I'm just going to read that because I think it's a very powerful poem. So it reads, "Every day on repeat, floating through this tiresome loop. I keep going and then defeat. What am I supposed to do? A constant battle from within. On the surface may not show. The label of lazy, I accept. Give up and just let go. Physical and emotional exertion others cannot understand. I fight this day daily, but yet again, fatigue the upper hand. It's slowly killing me to be this way. The way who is always asleep in class. You look tired, they say. Didn't you sleep? They ask. That's my fate. I cannot escape. The weight my shoulders bear, heavy as lead. Struggles go unsaid. For the next day, I prepare. How can I maintain normality and keep up with my peers? I'm constantly drained, can't concentrate. I'm losing my best years. Still, I remain hopeful, as one day things might change. So until then, I go again. Yeah, I just couldn't sleep, I say. So fatigue was socially having a significant impact on the young people, apart from the stigmatizing effect that it had. Some of the young people felt that they were losing their best years. As young people, it was time for them to develop their experiences, resources, build skills, have memories, engage with their peers, and be able to create these memories and experiences that will shape their adulthood. But with fatigue, it makes it hard for them to do that. And to them, it felt like they were losing their best years. Fatigue also had an impact on their schooling, their education, and the profession and career pursuit. For some of the young people, they missed school because of fatigue. And if they manage to get there, they struggle to participate and engage fully in school activities and school work. For some of them, fatigue meant that they slept in class because it came with this unshakable urge to sleep, and that exposes them to embarrassment, to punishment, and to ridicule. And they were also forced to alter their career plans and to be able to align with their energy capacity. So some of them talked about choosing apprenticeship over going to the university because they don't see themselves being able to meet the needs and the capacities and expectations of a university education. So fatigue was affecting their decisions about what they want to do in the future. Fatigue also presented fear, uncertainty, and concerns. For all the participants we talked to, the children and young people, the parents, and the health professionals, they all showed uncertainty and anxiety about the young people's ability to be able to lead independent lives. One young person was worried about getting older and having the capacity to be able to start their own family because they were already struggling with work due to fatigue. One parent was also concerned about her son's ability to be able to meet educational development in terms of being able to prepare and write examinations and be able to take on educational and career pursuits to the level that will help them develop to become independent adult. And the hematology consultant that was interviewed was also worried about the impact that fatigue can have on children and young people's potential to be economically gainful because they cannot take up educational and professional opportunities to develop to that capacity in the future. So in summary, the impact of fatigue on the young people was really significant. It had a significant impact on their quality of life and on their development. For them, fatigue means constantly going through life on a low battery. So to say, fatigue also means being socially dead, like a dead tree. And it also means that going through life without any sparkle. In spite of the impact and the significance of fatigue for the children and young people, which was clearly acknowledged not just by the young people and the parents, but by the health professionals, what we found out was that fatigue was invisible to people. It was easily overlooked and it was underestimated. There was no specific support for fatigue in current sickle cell disease services. It is not considered in health assessment, health consultations, patient and parent education, or even in transition services. Service provision and health providers prioritize monitoring and managing pain and other sickle cell related complications, but overlooked fatigue. And this was clearly really caused one parent to be very distressed, because it was during the study that she came to understand his son's experience of fatigue. She said that nobody told her about fatigue in sickle cell disease. So for her, everything he saw the son doing, such as his son's preference for being alone, for playing video games rather than being with siblings and with peers, for opting to draw or read rather than play football, or to listen to music and not wanting to play with others. She didn't know it was because of his son's fatigue until he listened to his own son talk about his fatigue as part of the study. For the mother, he thought that his son's behavior was because of sickle cell disease. He just understood it that children with sickle cell disease behave that way. It's a behavioral problem that comes with sickle cell disease. She didn't understand that it was his son's way of managing his fatigue, and that his behavior was not a problem, but it was rather a reaction to fatigue. And for this woman, there was a feeling of guilt after participating in the study, because he felt like, my son is 12 years old and I'm now knowing about this part of his illness. And this was because fatigue wasn't prioritized in service provision, in education. So this mother didn't know that what was happening to the son was because of fatigue. What we found was that excluding fatigue creates the impression that it is an unimportant and unresolvable problem, which families must cope with alone. Therefore, children and young people and their families did not raise it during health consultation, even when it was significantly impacting their quality of life. Some of the reasons that came out from the interviews for why fatigue was not highlighted in care provision was that health professionals lack understanding of sickle cell disease fatigue. Most from the interview, what we realized was that anytime they were to talk about fatigue, they tend to broaden the scope to talk more about tiredness rather than to talk specifically about fatigue as experienced by people with children and young people with sickle cell disease. So there was that knowledge gap and gap in understanding fatigue in terms of sickle cell disease. There was also lack of understanding of how to help patient, and that was something that made it difficult for health professionals to start conversations with their patients about fatigue, because they don't know what support to offer to families and to patients with sickle cell disease. And there was also no validated assessment tools to help clinicians to be able to manage to measure and manage the symptom. However, some of the young children felt that including fatigue in conversations in their care would be valuable for them, even if no support can be provided currently. Talking about fatigue as part of their care provision means that an important part of their life with sickle cell disease is being recognized and validated. So without a defined service provision for sickle cell fatigue, children and young people and their parents relied on their own experiences to manage the symptom, and they used various strategies to manage the energy. And this included frequent rest, activity pacing, increasing hydration, maintaining a healthy nutrition, taking multivitamin supplement, particularly vitamin D and zinc. Some of them also try to engage in moderate physical exercises to increase their heart and lung capacity. They also try to make sure they have adequate ventilation and enough oxygen circulating in their environment. And some of them also were using solitude and solitary activities as ways of managing their fatigue. And they describe these strategies that they use as a way of them taking care of, for instance, a house, a plant or a flower, or even how you take care of an electric car that sometimes you have to park it and charge it. So for them, these were the things they were doing on a daily basis to be able to take care of their fatigue. However, they were not entirely sure about how effective these strategies are, and they liked more reassurance from care professionals about how effective some of these strategies were. For the children and young people, managing fatigue also involved making daily decisions on the best way to use their limited energy. And this required considerable self-discipline and prioritizing their energy use. It meant either forfeiting a desired activity and opportunity or pushing themselves to complete an activity and thereby risking painful crisis. So for them, there was that always have to be that constant evaluation of where and how to spend their energy and weigh the cost and the benefit of daily activities and how much energy they should give to their day-to-day activities. Fatigue management also was constrained by financial limitations. So for them, being able to maintain vitamin supplementation, being able to eat well, being able to exercise all requires some form of financial commitment. Their self-management strategies were also limited by unsupportive social networks. So for them, the lack of understanding in terms of other people understanding fatigue as a significant aspect of sickle cell disease meant that their attempt to deal with their fatigue was not supported in school, in the family, at the workplace, because fatigue wasn't normally expected to be a symptom that they need to experience. And they also talked about poor housing, which made it difficult for them to maintain adequate ventilation and also to be able to have this space to be able to rest. What was also evident was that dealing with fatigue in terms of using rest and pacing yourself was something that was very difficult for the young people to balance. They talked about how it's not all the time that you can rest or pace yourself, and that particularly in school, activities are organized and arranged and regimented, and you cannot just decide to rest or pace yourself. So that makes it hard for them to manage their fatigue. They have to push themselves to continually to engage until their body shuts down. They also talked about how it's difficult to be able to moderate rest and balance it with productivity, that sometimes it's really a struggle, how much is sufficient rest as against how much is needed to maintain productivity. And one young person talked about it, that when your baseline energy is biologically low, when you even do the least, it looks like you are overexerting yourself, and it makes it difficult to balance between being productive and not overexerting oneself. And for one young person, there are negative consequences associated with rest and pace. For them, they felt that resting and pacing yourself always comes with a consequence for your education, your employment, finances, or social life, because you have to let go of something in order to make room for rest and pace, and which means that you are either always going to play catch up, or you will miss out, or you just have to accept to go through life at a mediocre level. So in summary, what we found from the study was that fatigue for children and young people with sickle cell disease, fatigue was the most restrictive and disruptive aspect of their day-to-day life, because it was a daily symptom they have to manage. It was inseparable part of their life. It wasn't something they can escape. It wasn't episodic. compared to the pain crisis, which was most of them was episodic. For fatigue, it was constantly always there and was linked to their daily activities, and it makes it difficult for them to escape it in their day-to-day life. It was both a medical and a social symptom. So medically, there was a biological reason for being tired, and so it had a significant impact on their social development, relationships, and interactions. And it also had an impact on their life decisions, their choices, and their outlook. Overlooking fatigue in care, research, and advocacy work, which is currently what is the state of fatigue when it comes to sickle cell care, research, and advocacy, means that we are ignoring an important aspect of improving the quality of life of children and young people with sickle cell disease and our ability to be able to reduce the disease burden for them and their families. So it is very important that we pay attention to this symptom in care, in research, and also in advocacy work as well. So what is the take home from today's presentation is that we all as clinicians and as the sickle cell community, we need to acknowledge the significance and the legitimacy of this symptom in our care, in the research and the advocacy work that we do. It is important that we include the impact of sickle cell fatigue in sickle cell disease education and advocacy work, and also in service provision. So in things like health assessment, in health consultation, admission and discharge plans, patient and parent education, transition services, school education and care plans were all the various ways that the research participant felt that fatigue can be acknowledged in those instances to bring significance and legitimacy to this symptom. There's also the need for a care pathway for fatigue management, and this should involve fatigue assessment and self-management programs. There's an urgent need for validated measurement and assessment tools and for self-management programs to support children and young people growing up with this symptom as part of their chronic illness. And it's also important that we start measuring fatigue as an outcome in evaluating current and future sickle cell disease therapies and disease-modifying treatment. This will be very valuable in being able to develop the resources and interventions to help address the symptom. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brenda. Thank you for really shining the light on this really overlooked issue in sickle cell disease, which is important to so many patients. And I think you've really hit the nail on the head when you say that probably the fact that most healthcare professionals don't address it is probably not ignorance, but just that we don't know what to do about it. And I thought it was really helpful that some of the young people said, even just acknowledging it is actually a good start. So we'll take some questions now. If people can just raise their hands, and then I'll call on you. Calvin Campbell, please. Oh,
hi.
Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. It's a great presentation. I wanted to ask, did your research take into account how fatigue and other symptoms may affect patients as they get older? So naturally, as you get older, the effects of fatigue and other issues caused by that, and pain, and how it affects you can increase. And then obviously having to you have a family, having to work and do other tasks like that. It's been interesting to show a difference between, a much younger sickle cell patient, a teenage sickle cell patient, someone older, and how it affects, and then how the treatment is then sort of molded to fit those different age groups and patients, and then how they also are viewed by the medical profession. I tagged with the tag of being lazy or whatever, which tends to happen in your school, and then continues on in your life, i.e. through work, such like that, not being able to do a particular job because people think that you're being lazy rather than just tired and fatigued because they just don't understand. Did any of your research take into account that? And if so, What were your findings? And if not, why not?
Thank you for that question. So we do have some evidence of how it evolves. So what we've realized that the experience of fatigue evolves as the young people goes through the life stages. So if I look at what we found in Ghana and what we found in the UK, and look at the data, so what you realize is that for very younger children where there's so much support from parents who tends to, in terms of being at home, there's so much support. They have a different view of the fatigue. They see it as something that is normal. Everybody goes through it. But once they move into adolescent, where there's that sense of independence and autonomy starts to develop, and there's that social expectations in terms of how they should engage, the extent of which they should engage. And when they have those expectations from friends, from parents, and also even from school, then fatigue really becomes significant, and it becomes really important to them because they are trying to be like their peers. They are trying to fit in, but they don't have the energy to be able to do that. And that is when the whole experience of being stigmatized for it starts to appear, where they are then labeled as being lazy. Why can't you do that? Why can't you measure up? It then comes in. And then for those who were in work, during the interviews, really talk about how they are struggling to be able to work the time and be able to, the number of hours as expected, or they want to work, they cannot keep up with that because it's just that not having the energy to be able to maintain that. And that makes them worried about what it will be like when they start having their own families. How would they manage family life with work and then with, having sickle cell disease? So although we didn't go beyond 23 years and we didn't have any of our participants who were married, but what we realized was that from 12 years to 23 years who participated, the fatigue evolved, and that for the adolescent and for the young adult, they talk about it as being more significant for them because they were now branching into independence, and now they have so much expectations to meet up with. But so that was what was happening in the data, and I think this is why I think there was limited understanding among clinicians, is that because we don't have that sort of research looking at fatigue specifically in sickle cell disease and look at how the symptoms also evolving and how treatment is impacting whether positively on this symptom, there isn't much understanding when it comes to that in research terms. So it's really one of the significant gaps, in my opinion, when it comes to understanding quality of life with sickle cell disease, as well as understanding the common symptoms of sickle cell disease. I think it's time that we've done a lot for pain. It's now time that we look at fatigue, especially now that people with sickle cell disease are living longer. It is now that this symptom is becoming important and significant and having an impact on their lives.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I say the point? So wouldn't that have been also why highlighting the effects of fatigue as people go past adolescence and sort of their mid-20s and seeing how it affects, because those issues will then be amplified as those young people go out to work, have families of their own, have pressures, and perhaps have to look after their own children, or just deal with everyday stresses of life where the fatigue and having to bring in the income would be a greater burden and pressure on them.
Yeah, so I think it's an area to really look at the adult population and really understand what it means to live with fatigue as a person with sickle cell disease, and navigating all that social rules and adult life with the conditions. To me, I think that is that should be something that needs to be studied. Although we just look at children and young people, I think it's also important that we look at the adult population to see these dynamics as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can we have Stephen Hibbs, please?
Thanks for a brilliant talk, Brenda. I'm also just starting a PhD in qualitative research in sickle, so I've really enjoyed reading your papers as well. I had a question. Interested to know if there's any significant differences in how people's fatigue plays out in their lives in the Ghanaian cohort you studied compared to the UK cohort. And the second part of that, I'd be really interested to know, across those two cohorts, were there any sort of cases that went against the trend of fatigue being a really significant impact on quality of life? Was there anyone who's actually had moderately good energy levels across both of those cohorts? And if so, have you got any reflections on what might be going on there?
So yeah, there were some contextual differences between how the symptom was experienced in Ghana and the UK. And one of the key things was culture. So in terms of how being a young person or an adolescent in the Ghanaian context was constructed was very different from the UK context, where in Ghana, it was really gender focused. So for young girls, you're supposed to, be domesticated. You need to take on chores at home. It was compulsory. You need to measure up to it. And for the boys, it was more about being with your friends. So being able to play football, being able to run, to engage with your friends. So those were the instances where, for them, those were the critical point for their fatigue, that it was very difficult for them to measure up to those expectations. And that was what exposed them to the stigma of having of not being able to engage in that. So for them, fatigue culturally was seen as a normal part of being an old person, and it wasn't part of being a young person. So you cannot say that you are tired. You cannot just walk a few steps and complain that you are tired. It wasn't acceptable, and they found it very difficult to navigate these social structures to get the support and acknowledgement for the symptom. But in the UK, it wasn't what we saw. When they talk about their fatigue, it was more of not being able to engage in school. So it had more to do with school, where they have to sit in class, they have to, constantly being able to engage. Expectations were around in school, and also having that time to be with their friends. So for most of them, if it was external, it was in the school environment. But if it was more of their personal, then it's their own personal choices of how they extend to it they want to engage with their friends. So there was some sort of control around them deciding in terms of their relationships with their peers, unlike the Ghanaian context where they were being policed and strictly you have to engage with. So there were that gender, in terms of gender, those were the differences, where in the UK it wasn't really clearly present that there were gender difference in the experiences in that regard. And in terms of those, there were some positive experiences in the Ghanaian data as well as in the UK data, but those were not linked to them having more energy. It was linked to them deciding what normality is for themselves and deciding that, okay, this is what my body can do. This is the limit of my body. I'm not going to go beyond that. I don't care what people view and think about me. So when they were able to construct, that when they thought that way, they talk about their fatigue positively. But when it's about meeting expectation and external expectation, and they strive to meet, then fatigue experiences were more negative and worse for them. So those were some of the studies, but it would be nice to really also take a look at the data again and see what other differences exist.
Thank you.
Great. Does anyone else have any other questions? Maybe while people are thinking, I've got a couple for you, Brenda. So it really comes across that fatigue is very isolating for these young people, and that's because they're comparing themselves to their peers. And I know that for the study, you spoke to people individually, but have you done any work with these young people to bring them together in a group? And is that something that's powerful for them to be able to speak to other people who've got the same thing as they do, and who, to have that sort of, you've got a different peer group, you're not comparing yourself to people without sickle cell? For this study, it was individual interviews, so we didn't bring them together. But like you said, it was one of the highlights of how they think support should look like for fatigue, that if they could have those peer support group
and as a way for them to talk about the challenges of living with the symptom, and just to know that they are not isolated for them, or it's not something that is peculiar to just their experiences, and also just to have the opportunity to learn from others how people are dealing with the symptoms and some of the social challenges of it as well. So peer support group was one of the recommendations that they gave as part of future programs for managing the symptom.
Great. I mean, it was also quite interesting to see how much the parents learned about their own children. That makes me think, gosh, we should really include the parents in this. We've got Olu Wilkie. Would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you very much. That was a brilliant presentation, and it opened my eyes, particularly because I look after children with sickle cell, and it's not one of the questions I tend to concentrate on when we're doing the annual reviews. We always talk about pain, and sometimes they do talk about tiredness, and it's normally in the context of maybe activities in school. When you talked about in the UK population, that's what you were talking about, that mainly it's generally about activities in school, and that's where it generally comes up, where they say they are tired, but they never use, maybe fatigue is probably not a word that they will use, but they will say, well, they can't keep up with their peers. And what we then say is that, well, most of the children, if the parents, some of our parents say, well, I don't want anybody else to know that my child has got sickle cell, and we do have some parents like that, but other parents are very happy and actually want the school to know, so that they're able to manage a lot of those symptoms in school. So we say that they can take part in activities, because we don't want them to be kind of isolated or feel different from anybody else. But when they are tired, they should allow them to sit down, rest, and then go back and do whatever they need to do. So that's to go back as much as they can, and it's really up to what they can do. And as you said, we talked about some children that actually are aware of that, and therefore they're able to say, look, I can't do that, so therefore I'm not going to engage in that. But there are things that I can do, and I will engage in those things, and they feel more positive about it. So that was one of the things that you said you found in your research, which was really very good as well. But for me, the presentation has just highlighted how much I probably have never really thought about the tiredness, and how chronic anemia, which is probably the cause of tiredness, can really affect our children. So thank you very much. And I'm going to take that back to my team and make sure maybe we add it into our annual review and say, how tired are you? But it would be nice if there was a scale, and also, I suppose, knowing and not being able to do anything about it is probably quite difficult as well. So ideally, we should have a scale to be able to measure it, and also be able to do something about it. Maybe provide some support, so not just in school, it's maybe at home. And one of the other things is that we talk about our children, because we do TCDs, transcranial Dopplers, we do neurocognitive assessments on our children as well. And maybe some of it might be that they are tired, and so therefore, obviously, their brains are affected anyway, but their concentration span is less, their memory, because of sickle cell itself, and them feeling constantly tired as well, might be affecting all that together. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Olu, for yeah. So I think that is what for us needs to be done, because we've looked at what measurement tools are available for fatigue. So there are some that has been developed for pediatric population, and it's developed from juvenile arthritis and rheumatoid arthritis. That was where those tools has been developed from, and they've been validated for other chronic conditions, but not for sickle cell disease. And I think we need to really look at these as tools and try and update them to make sure that there's something that is specific for sickle cell disease and can be used to measure or assess the symptoms and its impact, and also follow on from that, get some programs to help young people with that. So for me, that is what I tend to that is what our follow-on project is going to focus on, is really developing a program to help, so that clinicians can use that to help families and children and young people to self-manage the condition, and also to be able to develop some tools that clinicians can use to assess it. So for us, that is the way for what the future looks for us in this space.
Fantastic. I'm going to draw this to a close because it's 5 o'clock, but it just made me think while I was listening that we've got a chronic pain group, a national pain group for sickle cell, where we've got lots of different healthcare professionals involved in trying to focus on, you know, how do we quantify pain, etc. And maybe we just need to have our national fatigue group. So today we're launching the national fatigue group. Sorry. I think it might be good just from today, Ralph, maybe if you can sort of gather around the emails, we can invite people who are interested in this issue. And I'm working with some colleagues on a scoping review of different questionnaires and how applicable they are to measure fatigue. This is not just for sickle cell, but for all types of anemia. So I think there's a lot going on there that if we could just, those of us who are interested, just carry on with it, that would be a great move forward. Who you want to join the national pain group? I think Ralph, can you get the name of that person who's asked about the national pain group, and we will put them in touch with, and me too. Okay, so lots of people want to join the national pain group. I don't lead the national pain group. I can't promise that what they're doing, can't say anything about what they're doing and how many members they have and all that, but we'll certainly put it to them that there's other people interested. But let's start a national fatigue group.
Yeah, there's a question in the chat, if I can just quickly respond to that. Charlotte Ashton is asking how the research can be used to get extra time in exams for patients. So I just want to say that I have shared the report from the study with Raf. I think, Raf, I don't know if you still have a copy of that. So you can get a report, the summary of the report from Raf, and you can use that as a basis for your school navigating support for them in school.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody. Brenda, you've given us lots to think about over the weekend and going forwards, and you've got lots of interested people here. So let's take things forward and keep it moving.
Thank you
very
much.
Everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.